The time for small thinking is over. The time for trivial fights is behind us. We just need the courage to share the dreams that fill our hearts, the bravery to express the hopes that stir our souls, and the confidence to turn those hopes and those dreams into action.
Welcome back to The World Over. That was President Donald Trump striking a very different and optimistic tone. During his speech before a joint session of Congress this week, supporters and critics alike seem to agree that this was the best speech of his political life. The president outlined agenda items, including the economy, immigration, infrastructure, and health care. Here for analysis is the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, now a political contributor to MSNBC, Michael Steele. Welcome back.
In your neighborhood.
Hey, I want to start with your take on what you saw here. He really needed to do this. The question is, why did he wait so long? Why didn't he do this during the inauguration?
Well, and the question is, can he do it again? You know, but you're absolutely right. It is a work in progress for him, and something that the president, I think, realized. Given where he is in the polls right now, below 45% in some polls with approval, given the internal structure and frustration and back and forth and backstabbing that's going on right now in the West Wing over the last 40 days, he wanted to come out and nail this. He took control of the speech from the beginning. Stephen Miller wrote it and really sort of captured what the president wanted. So it turned out to be a great speech. And you talked about the top of the segment about his, the best speech of his political life. Well, his political life is about 18 months old, well, so not bad, right?
Well, look.
But he did what he had to do, Raymond, and that was the big thing. There was a lot of nervousness in the party about how this would play off. And then more importantly, people are already thinking to afterwards, what do I say in front of the press if this tanks? Mm-hmm. So you saw last night the Republicans smiling from ear to ear with the whole thing. It was a lot of fun to watch. The president did a good job. And I think now the question is, can he put the next foot in front of the last one and repeat what
Continue
he just
did? This. 7 in 10 in a CNN poll said he's moving the country in the right direction after watching this speech. Who do you think he moved?
I think he moved independents. I think that is a reflection of independent voters out there who were once termed Reagan Democrats. Those folks who came out in this election on the hope, wing, and prayer that Donald Trump would be the disruptor in chief, that he would be the president who would deconstruct, which is why the language that Bannon used last week at CPAC was deliberate, because it reflects an attitude that they've picked up in their internal polling about how people feel about this process. So the idea of deconstructing statecraft, state government, all of national government meaning, was an important part of this. And I think that speech last night sort of locked in for the time being. Because the battle of legislation begins next.
Well, I want to revisit something we talked about a little earlier, which is ideologically, this agenda is changing the very nature of the Republican Party, but we'll talk about that in a moment. I want to play this bite. This was about education and get your reaction to it.
Education is the civil rights issue of our time. I am calling upon members of both parties to pass an education bill that funds school choice for disadvantaged youth, including millions of African American and Latino children. These families should be free to choose the public, private, charter, magnet, religious, or home school that is right for them.
Do you see this gaining momentum in the Congress?
I do, because keep in mind, John Boehner championed that very ideal during his time as Speaker, and the Opportunity Scholars and the Opportunity Scholarships from D.C. is an example of that. So the fact that the Obama administration, from its inception, went after that program, and in its later budgets actually defunded it, and until the Congress figured out a way to put it back in many cases, to have this president now come forward and make that statement, I think is for those of us who have fought in this field for some time, in education reform, looking at vouchers, looking at charters, looking at homeschooling, all of that should feel really good about what the president is saying about broadening the reach of education in this country.
Do you agree with the president as an African American that this is the civil rights issue of our time?
It is one of the civil rights issues. As a friend of mine put it to me recently, he said, well, the civil rights issue of this time seemed to be civil rights in some cases. But it is one, and I do agree with that, because in terms of how we look at educating the next generation, let alone this generation, you've got to come to the table with a brand new set of tools, and the president, at least rhetorically, is willing to do that. Now, his education secretary's had some missteps in this last week of Black History Month, but the reality of it is the forward-thinking part of the process, I think, is good for the argument.
I got to move on to this because it speaks to the changing nature of the party during this Trump era. It was a major portion of the speech, and it had to do with spending, massive spending. Watch.
I am sending Congress a budget that rebuilds the military, eliminates the defense sequester, and calls for one of the largest increases in national defense spending in American history. To launch our national rebuilding, I will be asking Congress to approve legislation that produces a $1 trillion investment in infrastructure of the United States, financed through both public and private capital, creating millions of new jobs.
Now, Michael Steele, as the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, how do you create what the president here is calling an investment of $1 trillion in infrastructure, the largest spending on military, blowing the sequester away? How do you pay for this? Where does the money come from?
That is going to be a reconciliation for conservative fiscal hawks in the House in particular. This is not what they ran on in 2010, certainly not part of the argument that we were making to the country when we got them elected, that we wanted to restore fiscal balance, we wanted to restore fiscal responsibility, conservative stewardship of your taxpayer dollars. You have now a Republican president who's come into office talking about spending $1 trillion on infrastructure, $54 billion just on defense. So it's going to be over a period of about 10 years. You're looking at adding roughly $6 trillion plus to the national debt. So the question becomes for those conservative fiscal hawks, how do you pay for it? And I think that's going to be a major battle in the House. You've already begun to hear, Raymond, I'm sure in your travels you run into it, members on the Hill going, well, I don't know about all of that. I'm not feeling $1 trillion.
Yeah, that Freedom Caucus isn't going along.
They're not going for that. And the fact of the matter is, if it's bloated spending that is not targeted and specifically identified, it's just money going for infrastructure, just as we saw with Obama's $860 billion at the beginning of his term for, shovel-ready projects, et cetera. It won't go far.
Okay. What does this portend? Because what we're seeing here, this bouquet of issues, whether it's maternity pay, whether it's infrastructure spending, and then coupling that with defunding things like Planned Parenthood, this defies ideological categorization. This seems to be the remaking of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think that that's an important element of all that's happening right now. This president, as I've said, and no one can be offended or should be offended by it, he's not a Republican, he's not a conservative. So let's be clear about that. He's a populist, and he's a nationalist.
And he ran against both parties.
And he ran against both parties, and that's important to note. He ran against both parties. Bernie Sanders did pretty much the same, largely from the progressive side, although he didn't really dally too much with Republicans in what we were going through. He was focused on a separate agenda, but they meet up. And you had that voter who was the Trump-Sanders voter during the primary. Well, they're now the middle of the country. And what Donald Trump is talking about is reshaping ideologically and as well as on policy where the Republican Party has stood. Big government republicanism is now populism, Republican populism. They rejected that at the end of the Bush term, as you recall. A lot of folks pushed back on that in 2006 and 2008. He's remaking it with economic nationalism, and I don't know how easy that pill will be swallowed by a lot of those conservatives on the Hill. But more importantly, the base of the party, after 4 years of this, what does it look like?
Yeah, there was a beautiful moment where he called out this and gave attention to that Navy SEAL, Ryan Owens, who was killed in that operation. His widow stood. It was a very emotional, beautiful moment. And the president gave her time. It was the biggest applause of the night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
That attention to the military and to those in law enforcement, how important is that? And does that buy him capital to move things like immigration reform that is going to be very thorny on both sides?
I think it does. I think that, the country has moved into a law and order space in large measure, not because there's rampant crime, although they keep churning that narrative, but it's a testament to how people feel. They feel less safe for some reason, some unidentifiable reason in many cases. So that argument about securing our borders, tying it to national interest, national security, then wrapping in those elements where you have an illegal immigrant who commits a crime, kills someone, that brings it back into the neighborhood. So now we got to secure the neighborhood from not just ISIS and those folks out there, but from those who snuck in through the back door. So that all plays into a narrative that people have that they are uncomfortable. And it does give him the ability, I think, to stretch the argument on immigration, for example, and push against Republicans who may be resistant to the kinds of reforms that he wants to put in place.
Final question. Congress doesn't seem to be moving too quickly. They've done next to nothing. I know there's a lot of chitter chatter, but no bills, not one bill of substance.
It's a pretty building, right?
We're a month into this administration. What's happening? Why are they slow walking this thing?
Because they're uncertain about exactly what Donald Trump is going to do next, what he's already done, what does it mean? We've seen the blowback on the immigration executive action that he's put forth. He's now going to probably release that by the end of this week, early next week. And people are sitting back and waiting to see whether or not the administration is really going to move forward on some things. The other thing is they're waiting for the president to identify people that need to fill in some of those sub-cabinet positions so that they can approve those as well. So you've got this bottleneck on policy as well as personnel that's kind of slowed things down on the Hill.
Well, the stacking and the release of legislation, is so important.
It's important.
And
It's
if you
critical.
get that sequencing wrong, it can doom an agenda.
That's an important point, and I think that's something the administration's got to be mindful now about after the speech.
Very good. Michael
All right,
Steele,
buddy.
thank you as
Take
always.
care.
We'll look for you next time.